Hello and welcome to On Landscapes Any Questions podcast, featuring myself, Tim Parkin, and Joe Cornish, where
Good morning.
we invite a special guest to pitch some of our readers' questions to and some of our own questions. This week's guest is Paul Mitchell. Hello, Paul.
Good morning, everybody.
And we have quite a series of questions from people, and we've got them from semi-serious to quite entertaining. I think we'll start with a question from Jane Goodall regarding the difference between an image that has longevity and will stay on your wall for decades versus one that has instant appeal. This is looking at your history of producing pictures and selling prints and having exhibitions. What do you have any take on this? Paul?
Yeah, I can sort of condense it down to one sentence, really, which is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Quite simply, it's what one person sort of perhaps thinks an image has got instant appeal or longevity means something completely different to somebody else. It's. I mean, I always say an image that leaves perhaps a deep down personal memory is one that stays in my mind, and yeah, I mean, quite honestly, sometimes you look at an image and you say to yourself, "I wish I'd made that," and that's the sort of type of image that leaves a lasting impression.
Yeah. Do you find that when you've sold prints or when you're showing pictures of yours to other people, there's a big variety in what people like and what people don't like? There's not a lot of consensus. I mean, there probably will be for a few different images, but
It does surprise me sometimes what images people request and ask for prints from, and why do you want that one? Because that one's far better. But it goes back to this beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That they've got a particular connection with an image. I did an image which did rather well for me a few years ago, which was at South Gar up in Teesside, and it did well in the landscape photographer of the year competition. And out of the blue, some chap wanted an A1 print of it. And I hand delivered it to an office in London, and I actually met the chap, and basically it all boils down to he had his first snog in the fisherman's huts.
I like that one. Yeah.
Amongst the sand dunes, and yeah, I mean, everything means something different to everybody, I think.
Would you agree with that, Joe? It's a lot of it's location, but it's a sense of connection.
Yeah, everything that Paul said makes complete sense. It is, if you could read the minds of your audience, then maybe we'd be in a very different place. But the truth is that human beings are very unpredictable, and notions of, and it's tempting to think that there is a universal notion of beauty, and I do think that there are certain common threads for sure. I think that human aesthetics do have an evolutionary biological origin, but it's also massively affected by culture, by our own life experience, by our own landscape, by our own imagination, and so the result is that nobody's completely predictable in their responses, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that photographers are true to themselves in their work, because actually that's the only thing that really matters as a photographer when we're out with our cameras. I mean, I'm guessing that Paul would agree with that. I see in Paul's work a distinctive vision, even though his range of subject matter is extremely wide. Anybody who's looked at his website or knows his work, even though I suppose it's probably fair to say there's a strong association with woodland, because you have a great track record of working in the woods, absolutely beautiful work. But at the same time, you're very versatile, and that's because you can find beauty anywhere. And I think that's the mark of a really good artist.
I can see this from the competition we run, the Natural Landscape Photographer of the Year. A lot of judges, when they've come in, have said, they expected to be some sort of consistency in voting, but when you look at the actual voting on pictures, it's all over the place. There
That's
is some consistency in saying some images are good and some images aren't so great. But as far as favorites go, very little commonality between people.
And also Joe will probably reinforce this. Is the same on when we're doing assessing RPS panels. We have 4 or 5 assessors, and we all have our own opinions.
and that's really, yes. Sorry, Paul. That's so true. And isn't it the as far as I can tell, in a field where there is no empirical absolutes, rights and wrongs, like you can say in mathematics that there are a certain formulae that give you absolute answers and so on. But aesthetics, there is no such common ground. You can't analyze it that way. So the system we use is based on opinion, on the opinion of experienced assessors, and as far as I can see, that's the fairest system there is currently.
I'd like to ask a question based on that from sort of about RPS panels and judging, which is, when you are judging these things, you've obviously got your subjective opinion of what you like and what you consider good. And I'm sure a lot of people that are submitting work would like to think there is an objective assessment by the judges. Do you think it's possible to objectively assess pictures?
Well, first of all, Tim, we're not judges.
Yeah.
We are assessors.
Yeah.
We assess work, and we assess to guidelines, a set of criteria, it pretty much is the same criteria across the board, basically. But we're looking for certain things. It becomes more difficult at fellowship level because the one part of the criteria that most people struggle with is we're looking for something that is distinctive. Well, what is distinctive? And that's when subjectivity comes into it. But we try to be as objective as possible. But each one of us, we're all, I would say, pretty genned up in our particular subject, landscape photography. So we should know what we're sort of talking about. But we each have our own opinion.
Yeah.
But we try to look at things objectively, not subjectively. Before now, I've given a successful conclusion to a panel of birds on sticks. It's because they were very beautiful, it's hard not to be subjective sometimes, but we have to be, I think, as objective as possible, or be seen to be objective when we assess, not judge.
And that's, sorry, if I can just follow up on what Paul said, because that's all absolutely right. But just to try to sort of expand the sort of terms of reference slightly, I think that what we try to do is to evaluate the work on its own terms. Because it's true that we can't detach ourselves from our personal subjective opinion, and there'll be certain kinds of places even that we like or drawn to. I mean, in my case, wild landscapes are really where my heart and soul is, and so I naturally have a bias when I look at those kinds of pictures. But at the same time, I'm trying to detach myself from that bias and make sure that the quality of the work, the seeing, the technique, the intention of the photographer, the aesthetic language they're using, all of those complex interweaving themes are evaluated. And I ask myself, as I think we all do on the panel, does it work on its own terms? And if it does, then it gets our approval. That's basically how it works. Yeah. But it's there are these two different levels that Paul and I assess as well, and fellowship in particular is very, very difficult.
Is it another interesting aspect of that is about composition? And I know, Paul, you're a graphic designer as well, and there is obviously you're looking at composition objectively, but is there a fundamental are there fundamental ideas about good composition and bad composition in terms of when you're assessing Because if we're doing it objectively, that suggests that there should be. And is composition important for assessments?
Um, I mean, composition again is something that it's hard to quantify. You know, what I think is a good composition, somebody else might think is a bad composition. And it goes back to this beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You know, it's if I think all the elements are in the right place, I don't abide by all the sort of rule of thirds or anything like that. But if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And it's very hard to pin that down sometimes. It's instinct. And also experience, instinct and experience. I mean, I mean, we've had quite a few people applying for distinctions and stuff, and perhaps on maybe two or three occasions where they've been unsuccessful, and they're making the same errors time after time, and that is to do with composition and not thinking about it. And I just think that in some instances they're perhaps not ready at that level, and but there's hope for us all because you just keep going back and practicing.
Yeah. I mean, you've both seen a lot of students developing their photography. Do you think, Joe, do you think composition is an innate thing? Do you think there's a sense of instinctive composition that comes out in some people, or is it possible to work at it and get good at it?
Oh, that's a $1 million question, and I would probably I think personally that there's a strong innate sense or instinct, and people have their own way of seeing, even though there are these sort of universal uh, elements as well, which I think are to do with evolutionary biology. So, to expand a little bit on what Paul said, although it's difficult I mean, traditional rules, as far as I'm concerned, are ridiculous, but there are principles of balance, tension, flow, energy, relationship, which these are very woolly kind of forms, but you kind of know that when these elements are working properly, the picture has a life. And to me, that's the if there was only one single thing that you could define as composition, it would be that. If there's a
Yeah.
life to the picture, does it have a does it have an does it does it have a presence of its own? It could be very static, but it still could have a form, a life. Some pictures can be very dynamic, and those are the ones that we tend to think about, maybe using compositional elements. But how is that translated? Where does it come from? I personally have I suppose I was quite lucky in many ways in my own photography to not be formally taught, so I never developed any pattern or habit of based on kind of rigid principles. It was always instinctive. And I genuinely feel, if you look at many of the photographers who we all admire, one of the common themes is that many of them are musicians, or have a musical background. And I believe that one of the reasons for that is that musicians, fundamentally, music is an abstract form. It doesn't describe anything specifically. It's just a thing in its own right. And you and I have discussed this before, Tim, but the principles of composition can be understood as an abstraction. And that's one of the reasons that we encourage people to turn their pictures upside down when they're evaluating them, in order to understand the pure abstract relationships in the composition. So, I mean, sorry, might be going a bit too far here, but I do think that that's a fascinating topic. And anyone who's a graphic designer like Paul will understand, the
Well,
fundamentals.
I was going to say that about the graphic design side of things, because it is. I have seen quite a few landscape photographers that I know who I admire in terms of composition and balance have been graphic designers, and I think there is some common ideas about balance and form you learn from placing text on a page or objects on a page and using the page as a frame. Would you agree with that, Paul?
I do, and it's all about space. Because no matter whether you're presented with a book, so you've got two open blank pages to work with, or a magazine, or a poster perhaps, or for many years one of my specialities was packaging design. And you were literally presented with the fascia of a box for cornflakes, and but you had to look at it in a three-dimensional way, because you had the sides, you had the back, you had the top, you had the bottom. Um, but I think the most important thing for me is this, being acutely aware of space and how things interact with that space. And it's the same with photography. I often, I still today, if I'm sort of sitting down thinking about ideas for a particular project, a design project, that is, I start off with a layout pad. I've still got one here by my desk with a magic marker, which I sort of sketch out ideas and everything else, and just to formulate sort of germs of ideas, and then you can sort of build on that. And I often say it's the same with a camera viewfinder. You start off with a blank viewfinder, and then you've got to populate that viewfinder with ideas. I mean, photography and graphic design have always been inherently interlinked. Because my first job was with a company called Carlton Studios, which was in London, and they used to do all the photography for the mail order catalogues. Sort of, I don't know if you remember K's and Grattan's and Great Universal and everything else. We had 14 studios in this warehouse. The whole of the basement was devoted to processing. But it's, I mean, at the end of the day, it's I wanted to be a photographer when I left art college, but I knew that after leaving art college, I would have to be employed as an assistant for the next 3 or 4 years. After moving down to London, I had to find somewhere to live. I had to pay my way, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't afford to spend another 3 or 4 years being an assistant. So I went into sort of graphic design. But the two have always been related. You know, I worked as an art director for one of the big advertising agencies, and I was working with photographers all the time. So there's something at some point that you just interact with each other,
Yeah.
but photography for me was always a relief from all the sort of day-to-day sort of drudgery of giving clients what they wanted, and it just meant that after the end of the day or the weekend, I could go out on my own with my own camera and do what I wanted to do. But
Kind of
yeah,
interesting.
I think graphic design and photography are interrelated.
Yeah, I mean, I used to be a big fan of. I don't know if you remember David Carson, who used to do
Yeah,
a magazine, yeah, Raygun, and he combined text typology and photography
yeah.
images in a really creative way. And I can't remember who was the designer who did ID magazine. Um,
Oh,
he's a very good guy. And
something Brody, wasn't it?
Neil Brody,
Neil
Neville
Brody,
Brody.
Neville
Yeah,
Brody.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah, because
yeah,
he did the face,
that's right.
magazine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So they're fantastic, fantastic idea. Just about putting things on a frame. Anyway, back to our readers' questions. We got one from Neil McCubry, which is he says it seems that landscape photography, as seen in non-landscape, is taking a more romantic view, focusing on natural beauty rather than the vernacular. Are the likes of Faye Godwin or Chris Kippin now out of fashion? I'd like to think we feature more of that. I know contemporary photography than we used to. However, it is inevitably more romantic.
Tim,
Do you think
can I jump in there?
you
Because
can? Yes.
I just think that's an incredibly selective view of on landscape for a start. One of the things that you can say about the magazine is that there has been a hugely wide-ranging intake of different kinds of photography over the years. And I mean, you had your review just a week or so back article, which again reminded us of some of the extraordinary range of different contributors that we've had, and includes all genres of landscape photography. So I personally dispute the premise of Neil's question. I do. I also have another thing I'd like to say about it, which is that I think Chris Kippin, I think he means Chris Killip. Do you not
Yeah,
think?
yeah, it could
Yeah.
be. It's
Yeah.
I
So
thought, who's that?
yeah.
yeah,
So Chris Killip had a great show at the Baltic.
Yeah.
It was on last year. Paul, you saw it, did you?
Yeah.
Fantastic work, unbelievable, and what a great photographer. Sadly died. I think it was in 2018 now, having been a professor of photography at Harvard for the last 15 years of his or so of his life. And I have a little bit of didn't know Chris personally, but I know several people who did know him. So I have a great interest in his work, and I have a couple of his books as well. And Faye Godwin was a huge influence on me when I was younger. I actually met her at a show in a photography gallery in 1985, I think it was, when I was probably still assisting. Very overwhelming experience to meet her. Um, but I think that it's a mistake to think that Faye's work was somehow not romantic. And also, the biggest dispute I would have with Neil is the premise of the question, because it poses the question that romantic is not political. And that is not true. It is political, and it always has been ever since the romanticism of the 18th and 19th centuries, which, without wanting to go into sort of academic treatise in it, is often to do with protest against the establishment, and is particularly concerned with the degradation and destruction of the natural environment. And the romanticism is in many ways a desire to show what remains of the beauty of the world and it, depending on how it's presented and framed, is part of a movement to resist habitat destruction and the continuing degradation of the natural world.
I think from the point of view of the romantic and beautiful being popular, I think a lot of maybe contemporary photographers don't look at beauty as a popular subject for a few art reasons to do with postmodernism, etc., that have hung over from new topographics. But Simon Norfolk had a great phrase, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't know the exact quote. But somebody asked him why are your pictures beautiful when they're about politics and war? And he says beauty is a tool, and as long as it works, I'll keep using it. And I like that idea. But I think where Neil McCoubrey is probably coming from is why is beautiful photography more popular with people who pursue it as a hobby? Um, I have an idea that potentially this is to do with people enjoying nature. But do you have any thoughts, Paul, about that dichotomy between or
Well, you
forcing?
just said it. I mean, it's enjoying nature. I do what I do because I more than anything like being outside. I hate being sort of cooped up in an office, and I've done it the whole of my career. So the more I'm outside, the better. If it means that I come back with what I would call some beautiful images, then all the better. But I don't specifically go out to photograph um, pretty things and sort of beautiful sort of scenery and everything else. But I mean, coming back to the question, focusing on natural beauty, I mean, I think uh, Joe said it in his when he sat down and wrote the mission statement for the landscape photography genre with the RPS. It's something that I often refer to. It's photography in the eyewitness tradition, you know, uh, and uh, and but at the end of the day, it is pure pictorialism. I mean, pictorialism goes back to the 19th century, and it was very very popular then. And it's only really just recently that we've started to sort of have this more of a contemporary view of the landscape. One of my favourites is Harry Corey Wright. I very much enjoy his work, for instance. In actual fact, only not last weekend, the weekend before, I was sitting right next to having lunch with Simon Roberts. And I had a very good chat with him about the difference between sort of what he does and pictorialism and everything else. But with people like that, it's images that have a narrative, you know. And I'm not really one for coming up with a narrative behind my images. You either like it or you don't like it, and I take photographs for myself. I don't take photographs to have a particular story behind it or anything like that. And But there are lots of others. We mentioned Faye Godwin. Faye introduced me to the Ridgeway up in Oxfordshire. And I wish I could afford one of her books. I can't. They're so expensive nowadays. But other contemporary photographers, John Tonks is another favourite of mine as well. Um, I'm going back to this politics. I think politics nowadays has become so tribal. In its outlook, it's not about sort of rights or wrongs and what particular policies that appeal to you or everything. It's all about tribalism, and there are some photographers on the Conservative Party that I particularly enjoy. Rory Stewart is a favourite of mine, for instance, because he talks a lot of sense. There's a lot of people in the Labour Party that talks a load of rubbish. It's but I think to bring politics into photography is I'm not keen on that, because I'm not I I'm one of these passive people. I don't like sort of passive aggressiveness, and aggressiveness does come into politics quite a lot, and I don't think it should be in photography.
Yeah. Do you think some of the essentials around politics is maybe the wrong word for it, but more of a protest photography in terms of documenting the ails? I mean, the classic examples maybe like Peter Dombrovskis protesting hydro projects, etc. We don't see as much of that. Do you think there's a reason for that?
Well, there's a particular photographer up in the Highlands that is often protesting about hydro schemes in valleys and putting up transmitters and stuff like that.
Now and again.
No, no, I think that I think Peter Dombrovskis was really highlighting something that is a problem at the moment, which is the destruction of habitat. And he was probably one of the forerunners in that. Again, if I could afford to buy some of his books, I would do. But there's lots of Peter Dombrovskis's work online, and it's somebody I often refer to as an influence in my own sort of photography. But yeah, I tend not to be really political about my photography.
Can I again jump in, Tim? Because just on Peter Dombrovskis, I think that is such an interesting example for many of us. Because I mean, like Paul, my primary love in photography is just being outside and looking at the things that I find beautiful and wanting to make a picture that says something, expresses something to me about it. And usually that's the wildest fringes of our landscape, because that's as I said earlier where my heart lies. And I don't think Peter was any different in many ways when he went out into the Tasmanian wilderness. That he was a Tasmanian or Latvian originally, but lived in Tasmania all his life. He didn't go out with a specific intent to protest about anything. He went out in order to do his landscape photography and to make a living. But what happened was, inevitably, when you are part of that sort of artistic community, you will inevitably meet others. And as his work became more and more influential, it was also sort of taken up by the Green Party, and it was other people actually who persuaded him to use his work in a political environment to stop the dams on the Gordon Franklin River system, which is what his work became renowned for. So it was, and Peter, we should credit his work for bringing genuine political change and protection to the Tasmanian southwest wilderness. But it wasn't him alone. It was other people, as it were, weaponizing his work in a political in a political sense. So, I sort of see that he was able to achieve a great deal of good to protect nature using the power of his imagery, and I find great inspiration from that. You can get great inspiration from Peter's work just for its aesthetic appeal, though. He doesn't have to be seen as a specifically political thing. But I mean, as a, I'm keen on the idea that photography can be a force for good.
Yeah, I think it can. I think one of the problems, probably at the moment, or what it's not a problem. One of the things that's changed dramatically is in Peter Dombrowski's day, there was a narrow range of places to distribute narrative, journalism, and pictures.
Yeah.
So everybody read the same thing. Everybody watched the same television, and there weren't many photographers. So single photographers could do a great deal of work by just getting an advertising campaign in one newspaper potentially. Whereas nowadays, everybody's a photographer. So anything that's being seen as a crime against wildlife, crime against nature, is being documented by citizen journalists. So the photographer isn't as important, and the channels which they can put that media out there aren't unified in the same way. So people making stuff on TikTok aren't the people doing it on YouTube, aren't the people putting it in the Guardian or the Telegraph. So I don't think that there's as much power as there was because of that, which is a bit sad. But occasionally you see, I'm thinking of Batinsky, who stands out as the most recent person who's being work on that scale.
Yeah, just wanted to jump in on that, and I was wondering if Paul had seen the Batinsky show at the Saatchi Gallery. So I'm actually going next week, and I have seen a couple of videos on it, and read reports and heard first-hand reports from friends who've been. And I mean, maybe Batinsky is the last dinosaur of photography, because he can still command that kind of respect and focus and money, frankly, because I mean it's a huge show, and also that show, I have to say, has a huge carbon footprint of its own, and that concerns me a little bit. But at the same time, what he's doing is just for everybody's benefit, listening, watching. It's a major exhibition about our exploitation of planetary resources, and and why I think it's a really interesting example, given the conversation preceding this, is that nobody understands better than Ed Batinsky the importance of abstraction, because that's actually part of the title of the show, abstraction and extraction, and also beauty. His photographs are absolutely beautiful. They may be of toxic waste running through an estuarial system, but they're still beautiful in terms of pattern, in terms of graphic design, in fact. So, in many ways, he is the photographer who epitomizes the kind of old school ability to bring together great photography, great eyewitness photography, but for a political cause. I mean, it has to be said, it is a political cause. It's to highlight habitat destruction, toxification of the environment, which, whether we like it or not, we're all connected to.
Is the exhibition worth a visit, Paul?
I'd like to go. Yeah.
Are you
How
not?
long's it? No, I've not been yet. No, I've only exhibited at the Saatchi Gallery. I'm sorry. No. Yeah, it's something that is on my radar, and I'm going to go and visit it. It unfortunately, where I live now, it's not just a half an hour's train journey into central London. It's almost like an all-day job to sort of get there. But yeah, it's something that I want to go and see. Absolutely.
Okay, I've got a question for Paul from Adam Piacella. He says, a few years ago, I had the pleasure of being with Paul in a workshop in Glencoe, during which Paul demonstrated some of his editing and processing techniques and how he achieves his style. Obviously, images will vary according to the season, to the woods and the trees, etc. But over the last few years, has Paul changed his editing and developed any new looks or ideas around post-processing presentation?
No, because I mean, yes, post-processing, I think, is a big part of what I do. But I always say to people when I'm on my workshops is that as the very second that I release the shutter to make an image, I have a mind's eye sort of vision of what it is I want that image to look like. Now, it may not end up looking like what was actually in front of me, but it's my vision. It's what I wanted it to look like when I made the image, if you know what I mean. And that above all stays with me when I process my image. So I don't really sort of. I mean, the only thing I do is I process in Lightroom and finish off in Photoshop. I mean, yes, over time I've started to use things like topaz denoise but that's more of a technical thing to get rid of high ISO noise, But I don't use filters and effects to fundamentally change my images. I just process my images the same as I've always done in my mind. But obviously, it changes as my mood changes. And sometimes going out in the winter time, you come back and you process your images completely different as you would do in the springtime, for instance. In the
Do you tend to
springtime,
have a sense of? Do you have an internal sense of what things look like photographed? Then,
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's all part of this pre-visualization. It's. I often say, you've got to pre-visualize what it is that you want that image to look like, and rather than just mirror exactly what was in front of you. I mean, sometimes it works. Sometimes you think that's it. That's exactly how it was, and that's how I want it to be. But sometimes you can go out and on a dull, drab day, and there's no color in there. That there isn't any light, for instance. There's no sort of variation of contrast. But you can introduce that into your picture. As long as the elements are in there, that you wanted to capture, and that's the beauty of working in sort of the digital era. But saying that, I mean, a lot of my images that were made on film, I sometimes go back to reprocess them using the same techniques as I do now.
Out of interest, I'm presuming you're using a mirrorless camera now.
Yeah, so I use a mirrorless DSLR, and it's a Nikon, but other brands are available.
Yeah, I'm more interested in when you're using your camera. Do you have any particular settings on the viewfinder? I mean, for instance, when I'm taking photographs, I tend to use more of a landscape style, so I can see the color effects rather than a flatter style.
Well, no, because I mean, the camera is a tool, and again, the viewfinder, I start off with a blank viewfinder and populate it with ideas, as I've already said. And I don't have any particular preferred settings. I sometimes use a Fuji camera, and you've got all the film emulations on there, but I just leave it on Provia,
Yeah.
And same with my Nikon. I just use Adobe RGB.
Yeah, just a little bit of contrast, and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but it's what I want that image to look like when I come back and I sort of download it and sort of process it. That's the most important thing.
I've got a question from Herbert Schlatt from Mr. Cornish asking about. He mentions, I think he's taken an extract from here from Joe, saying that you said at one point Instagrammers are destroying nature. It may have been a phrase pulled out of a longer conversation. Do you think we have a responsibility still to act in an environmental way while we're out photographing? For instance, he says he visited Wisman's Wood and noticed that to capture the picture he wants, he would cause damage in the area, and the signpost saying don't go there, and the places you could go there were already footsteps. So do you think we have an ethical responsibility to say actually these places shouldn't be trodden on?
Oh boy, where to start? That's such a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think the biggest difficulty for me is the the kind of feeling that I'm going to be charged with hypocrisy, whatever I say, um, uh, with regard to this. Because I mean, I feel when I go out into the landscape that want to really experience it fully. I quite often go off the beaten track. I do. I would say that I do my level best to do as little damage as I possibly can. But I mean, in fairness, what I try to do is think about what our ancestors or wild animals might do in terms of wandering around. I mean, if you stick to the path, you're on the path, you're not doing any damage. You do go off track, then inevitably you're going to break through mosses on stones. You're going to damage delicate plants from time to time. But especially in the North York Moors, most of those plants are heathery and they're very tough and they just spring back anyway. So a lot of the time it's not a problem. However, there are places where it is a massive problem, and without wishing to make it worse, and Wistman's Wood, which has been widely photographed by contemporary photographers, has been literally popularized. And the problem with it, as I see it, is it was, up until very recently, one of the last few remaining truly unspoilt natural woodlands in England that had been virtually untouched for hundreds and hundreds of years. I did go once, I think it was in 2015, 2016, when it was still very beautiful. I was very careful. A couple of times I remember thinking, if I stand there, I'm going to do some damage, doing my level best not to do that. I've always been very, very careful where I put the tripod. But the truth is, as soon as we walk into a space, we're starting to change it. I suppose that if it's only an occasional footfall, just as if a cattle or sheep were to move through the area, they would also damage the understory, and then it'll recover. But once a lot of people go to a place, then the damage starts to become embedded or permanent. And anybody, for example, if we take another example, a very popular and well-known one, which would be pretty close to you, Tim, of the A82 and Rannoch Moor.
Yes.
Yeah, if you Lochen na Hacklisher, which is a very, very popular photographic destination for good reason, because it's a very beautiful landscape there. But the understory of that loch side has been destroyed almost beyond recognition now, because the likes of me walking along there, and others doing the same, and I bitterly regret that, but I don't know what the answer is, because I also feel that the opportunity to encounter nature's beauty is not exclusive to photographers, obviously, or professional landscape photographers, and I would never claim that. But the truth is that, the popularity of sorry, just to go back to the original question, popularity of Instagram, and the desire to harvest popularity through Instagram does put a lot of pressure on places that are actually quite vulnerable and quite fragile.
I think people need to educate themselves on how the landscape reacts to recovery, for instance, and recognize that some places may start to be damaged and hence back off from them. And other places are very popular and will be damaged. I mean, we have many walks in the Lake District and in Scotland that are walked by thousands of people, and they have become motorways of human traffic and inevitably change the landscape. And going off piste can help with that, but you need to. I think the key there is being aware of what you're doing and being aware of what damage you can cause. For instance, in America, they have a problem with crypto soils. I think, is it cryptozootic soils?
Cryptobiotics.
Cryptobiotic soils, where you can destroy the environment of the soils just by treading on it once. So I think as photographers, we aren't the only person causing this problem. I talked to one of our local rangers about the Buckle waterfall point, and he said that actually wasn't bad comparing to the damage that the kayakers had done in certain places in Glen Etive. So it's a part of humans enjoying nature is the fact that the majority of them will enjoy the same nature and inevitably impact it more. So
As a
It,
juxtaposition to all that, and I agree with everything that you've said, but only yesterday on the BBC News, I saw that there was a disused slate mine in Wales where they dumped cars and televisions and all sorts of things, and it's all in a big sort of almost like um, a glacier coming down into this
wow.
disused mine, but people were complaining that it was being sort of disrupted and uh, almost vandalized by Instagrammers, and you think, well, it's already been vandalized. I mean, for a start, I mean, the hole is man-made anyway. I mean, man has dug it out to sort of extract this slate, and then man's just come along and filled it up with rubbish. And then accusing people of going along and vandalizing it with leaving rubber dingers and sort of spray painting the walls and everything else. It just made me laugh so much, and that's how ridiculous the world is sometimes, I think. And
I think we
I
humans
think
don't like change, do we?
no,
sorry.
I mean, I think there's a couple of other things I wanted, sorry, Tim, to add. One is there are certain places that are much less vulnerable. So think of the intertidal zone, and we have lots of coast, obviously, in the UK. All of that is essentially well, not invulnerable, because obviously you can leave rubbish and litter, which you shouldn't do. But if you just walk down onto a stony or sandy beach, you might get hurt, but the beach won't, because the tide's going to come in and essentially sweep itself clean twice a day. So that's something you can, I think, innocently walk out onto with your camera without ever having to worry that you're doing too much harm. Hopefully, the other thing is that living in a post-industrial landscape as I do on the edge of the North York Moors, I've seen the damage that our ancestors did to this part of the world in the process of extracting materials. This almost bring us rather back to the Bertinsky theme again. And they did do a huge amount of damage and change the landscape. But since it's been abandoned from quarrying, from mining, and that process has been gradual, but there's no active mining or quarrying on the North York Moors now. Hasn't been for the last probably 40 or 50 years. And a lot of the mines were abandoned before then. So nature has returned, and in its own way, these places are starting to look quite picturesque as they become ruinous industrial sites. So there is always hope because nature's incredible resilience, and it's just something to keep in mind when we have these conversations. But I am conscious. I think it's slightly the way that the question was posed to me did make me feel a bit nervous. I must admit that I was accusing Instagrammers of destroying the natural world or something like that. That wasn't quite what I meant.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question from Mike West for Paul regarding book design. He says, what are your thoughts on the amount of variation in photo formats within a book? He says he's seen it in both directions, using a consistent format throughout a book to try and create focus on the images only, or more variety for interest. But then when does the design become a distraction? And I'm intrigued by this as a question anyway, because I think I've seen both extremes as being negative. But what are your thoughts about this, Paul, in terms of book design and
Well,
putting?
first of all, I think Mike refers to photo formats. I would imagine as aspect ratios.
Yeah, yeah, or how it's laid out on a page as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. So obviously, landscape, portrait, and everything else. Well, I mean, once you've actually decided what size the book is going to be and what orientation it's going to be, then and being a landscape photographer like I am, I have both landscape and portrait images, and so invariably it's going to be a little bit of a mix. I think you're setting yourself a bit of a challenge really to fill a book all with one sort of aspect ratio. Saying that, I mean, Harry Corey Wright. I mean, he's predominantly all landscape
Landscape technique.
images,
Yeah.
and so it does bring a certain amount of regularity and cohesion to a book having one. But it's like we've already talked about it, different sort of processing techniques and everything else. Uh, uh, I sort of adapt to. Just can't think of the word at the moment. Yeah, I mean, it really doesn't bother me mixing up different sort of aspect ratios in a book. Um,
What about
uh,
what about things like full bleed and crossing the fold, etc.? Because I know when I've done the natural landscape book, I looked at a lot of books and ended up using all sorts. I've got had pictures that were like half the page lined right and full bleed on three sides, all the way to.
yeah, I mean, it's just making the book look interesting, and sometimes it works with just having a landscape image with a regular amount of border around it on each page, but then sometimes it works, mixing everything up. So you're using three-quarters of a page or three-quarters of a spread. But it comes back to the thing that I mentioned earlier, space and the use of space. And I think space in books is more important sometimes than the pictures.
Yeah,
It's what you leave out, not what you put in. It's what you leave out sometimes.
I like to
And
think I like to think of a book as a symphony, as it's in
Yeah,
terms of uh, intensity, space between things, and
yeah,
breaking stuff up. And
That's a brilliant analogy, and it is the right one. If only all photographers who did their books thought of a book in that way, I think books would generally be a lot better. Because clearly, the variety of picture types that we shoot is quite wide. But what matters is can you can you imagine the life of a book as in the life of an individual photograph, as described by sort of elements of composition and lighting. But the book itself has a life as well. The way that we sequence, the way that we put chapters together, the relationship between all of those images and maybe the words and the flow and so on. All of that gives it a kind of cohesion, the word that Paul used, and the kind of feeling that there's an intention and a deliberate approach to the way that images are positioned on the page. I think that's fundamental. Using full bleed is perfectly legitimate if there's a good reason for it, and as long as it's not overdone. Then that can become a bit tiresome. I actually think that variety is something to really be welcomed in a book, so long as the graphic design is really good. If the graphic design is good, if it's intentional, and it feels balanced, and there is that space, as Paul says in it, then the book will be satisfying. But
I mean,
I
I
think the sort of symphonic, sorry, Paul, just the symphonic concept is a great one. That's how it
yeah,
should be.
absolutely. And but books. It's often said there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But sometimes I like to start at the end and work towards the back of the book as the beginning. Everything is possible with book design, I think, and because I sit on the photo book panels as well with the RPS, and you get people that. And this is something I see a lot. They're presented with all these blank pages if they're working in something like Blurb or there's something online, and they see white space and they just want to fill it, fill it with everything, and that is the wrong thing to do. And also they perhaps they've got a folder full of images that they want to use to populate the book with, and they'll put all the images in according to the actual file names. So if the file names are in alphabetical order, so there's no sense of rhythm to it. Everything is all jumbled and mixed up. And But not everybody has got the sort of design background like myself or even yourself, Tim. So my, I think, advice to people that really don't have that sort of design experience is just keep it simple. Keep it simple, and use space. Use space, and if it just means that you've just got one image on a page with a nice white space around it, then so be it, and as regards typography, keep it simple. Don't go for twirly, swirly fonts and that you can't read properly and everything else. Just stick to, I don't know, Times or Helvetica or something like that.
I was going to say one in terms of fonts. It's very very common for people to go and hunt things down. But I mean, I used Minion, which is the default Adobe Creative Suite font, and it's a
Yeah,
beautiful font, and it's because they spent a lot of money making it work in so many different
absolutely.
ways.
Yeah. Just don't
Okay,
use Comic Sans.
yeah. Or what's the one from the science fiction films? I can't remember now. Anyways, I have another question about your pinhole photography. This is from Ian Mead. I would like to know more about your pinhole photography technique, which equipment you use, and how you frame and compose without being able to see the image on the camera. I know you've got some brilliant pinhole photography, so.
Yeah, I think as Joe alluded to at the very beginning, my work is very eclectic, and I think it's because I'm just interested in everything and anything photographic. So I've dabbled in things like Polaroid transfers and emulsion lifts over my time, and solograms, and a little bit of cyanotypes, all sorts of things, but it was really a friend of mine that got me into pinhole photography, and where he used to change whole rooms into a camera obscura.
Okay, yeah.
And I used to darken out a hotel room, and just black out all the windows. And one of the windows, he just sort of, with a hole punch, put a hole in it, which is equivalent to a pinhole. He used to aim a large format camera at the back wall and just literally open the shutter. And he used to leave the hotel room for a day and then come back and see what was actually on the actual. So invariably, he had a picture of an inverted image of Windsor Castle on the back room of this hotel, complete with bed and wardrobe and everything else. It was really surreal, and that's how I got into pinhole photography. And then Steve Gosling came along, and he had a fabulous article in Amateur Photographer, I think, where he produced a series of square images made with a camera made in Hong Kong called a zero pinhole camera, and it took roll film. So you had the opportunity to make 12 images before you actually changed the roll, and it was convenient to sort of carry around. Whoop,
It's all right. Hang on a
phone.
second. Yeah, Charlotte's going to pick it up in a second.
Right, okay.
Okay,
And
roll film.
and that's how I sort of got into it, really. But I often say with pinhole photography, it's really a technique that relies more upon instinct and creative vision than using technology, which I really enjoy. I often say going back to the basics. I mean, you can't get any more basic with a wooden box with a hole in it. I think the only thing that was perhaps, using modern technology was using roll film, rather than sort of putting light sensitive material on a sheet of paper and just having sort of putting it in a shoebox. But yeah, it was the convenience of being able to walk around and sort of take sort of 12 images at a time. But as regards technique, yeah, I mean, it really is sort of, again, photograph what it is that you enjoy doing. And I often say to people that if you think you're too close to an object with pinhole photography, then you're not close enough. That's the thing I learned very early on, because it's extreme wide angle invariably, but you know. I think one of the questions that we had from, I think, Malcolm McNaughton, when he said about things like film, anything made on film is no longer acceptable. I got my associateship and my fellowship using film, and that was fairly recent. So it's not impossible to do that.
I think,
but the thing I like about pinhole photography is that it's going back to basics. And I often refer to Isaac Newton. It's almost like for every action, there's a reaction. And I think it was the world is moving so quickly and technology is moving so quickly. It's nice to get back to basics and not think about things like is my battery charged up, and have I got the right white balance, and what color space am I using? You just load a roll of film in a wooden box and off you go.
I have a quick follow-up.
Go on.
Sorry, Tim. I have a quick follow-up to that, which I had a friend, well, you knew him a bit too, Chris Ireland, and he actually used a phase one back on a pinhole camera. So it can be done with with that kind of technology as well. But I mean, just to reinforce the point that Paul's making, I think what makes pinhole so particularly appealing, and I can't say that I have any experience of it myself, but indeed film photography generally is that it's the unpredictability of it, and especially with pinhole, because even when you become quite experienced at it, there are a lot of unknowns, and that unpredictability is also, is parallel to the word creative in my mind.
I mean, it's the unpredictability of using film for a start, because film reacts differently, and especially with long exposures, you've got to think about reciprocity failure and everything else. You can't instantly review what it is that you've made. You've got to wait until you come back and process your images. There is no viewfinder as such, especially to the pinhole camera that I use. I simply use one of these 2.25 square GP slides, which I hold up against the back of the camera, and as soon as my glasses clink on the actual viewfinder, and I can then look all the way around 360 degrees, and that gives me roughly what it is that I'm actually photographing. But you still don't know what you're going to get until you actually develop the film. But as I said at the beginning, if you think you're too close, you're not close enough.
So do you think people just need to experiment with pinhole to understand what
Yeah,
works?
I mean, that's what it's about. People get too hung up on the technicalities, and I mean, there are certain apps that you can get now, Pinhole Meter app, that will work out roughly what exposure. But with using film, especially black and white film, the latitude that you've got in regards to exposure, you've got 3 or 4, even 5 stops either way.
I've never overexposed film. I've never had any film to scan on
No.
my drum scanners that's been overexposed, black and white.
Well, the only film I've overexposed or underexposed is Velvia. That was
exactly.
a pig.
But yeah, with black and white.
And with black and white, the latitude is just huge. So, I mean, literally, I can look outside now and I think, 3 seconds.
Yeah.
3 seconds, and I will get something on there. But people want to go down to I don't know, a fraction of a second.
I liked with a friend of mine who we photographed in Cornwall used to take a reading. He shot with color negative film. He used to take a reading in the morning after the sun had come up, and then use that for the rest of the day.
Yeah,
it's color negative. It works, and the same as for black and white film as well. So it simplifies things a lot.
Yeah, it just people overthink it. People overthink it, and it's all about being as simple as possible.
Sounds good. So I think with that we'll call it a day. So thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much, Joe, for another very entertaining podcast.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much.